The window of her room looked out onto the barbed wire fence that surrounded the ghetto. Musia Borisovna, the librarian, woke up during the night, lifted the hem of the curtain, and saw two soldiers dragging a machine gun. There were blue patches on its polished body, and the spectacles of the officer walking in front were glittering in the moonlight. She heard the quiet hum of motors. Cars and lorries with dimmed headlights were approaching the ghetto. The heavy, silvery dust swirled around their wheels. They were like gods floating through the clouds. Musia Borisovna watched as subunits of the SS and SD, detachments of Ukrainian police, auxiliary units, and a column of cars belonging to the Gestapo drew up at the gates of the sleeping ghetto. In these few minutes of moonlight, she took the measure of the history of our age. The moonlight, the slow, majestic movement of the armoured units, the powerful black trucks, the timid ticking of the pendulum clock on the wall, the stockings, bra, and blouse that seemed to have frozen on the chair. Everything most incongruous had fused together. Natasha, the daughter of Karasik, an old doctor who had been arrested and executed in 1937, tried now and then to sing in the cattle wagon. No one seemed to mind, even when she began singing during the night. She was very shy. She always looked down at the ground when she spoke, and her voice was barely audible. She had never visited anyone except her close relatives, and she was astonished at the boldness of girls who danced at parties. She had not been included in the small number of craftsmen and doctors whose lives were considered useful enough to be preserved. A policeman had pushed her towards a dusty mound in the marketplace where 3 drunken men were standing. She had known one of these men before the war. He had been in charge of some railway depot. Now he was the chief of police. Before she had even understood that these 3 men were the arbiters of life and death, the policeman gave her another shove. She had joined the buzzing crowd of men, women, and children who had been pronounced useless. Then they had walked towards the airfield in the stifling heat of their last August day. They had walked past the dusty apple trees by the roadside. They had prayed, torn their clothes, and uttered their last piercing cries. Natasha herself had remained quite silent. She would never have thought that blood could be so strikingly red. When there was a momentary silence, amid the shooting, screaming, and groaning, she heard the murmur of flowing blood. It was like a stream, flowing over white bodies instead of white stones. The quiet crackle of machine gun fire, and the gentle, exhausted face of the executioner, he had waited patiently as she walked timidly to the edge of the pit, had hardly seemed frightening at all. Later, during the night, she had wrung out her wet shirt and walked back to the town. The dead don't rise from the grave, so she must have been alive. When she made her way back to the ghetto, through the small alleys and yards, she had found people dancing and singing on the main square. A band was playing a sad, dreamy waltz that had always been one of her favourites. Couples were whirling round in the wan light of the moon and the street lamps. The shuffling of soldiers' boots and girls' shoes merged with the music. At that moment, this young, drooping girl had felt joyful and self-assured. Quietly, under her breath, she had begun singing in anticipation of some future happiness. From time to time, when no one was watching, she even tried to waltz. David could only very dimly remember what had happened since the beginning of the war. There was one night, though, when a little of what he had just lived through came back to him. It was dark, and his grandmother was taking him to the Bookman's. The sky was full of stars, and the horizon was quite light, almost lemon green. Burdock leaves brushed against his cheeks like cold, moist hands. Everyone was sitting in a hiding place in the attic behind a false wall. In the sun, the black sheets of corrugated iron roofing gave off a fierce heat. Sometimes the smell of burning penetrated their hiding place. The ghetto was on fire. During the day, they had to lie absolutely still. The bookman's daughter, Svetnochka, kept up a monotonous crying. Bookman himself had a weak heart, and in the daytime he looked as though he were dead. During the night, he ate some food and quarrelled with his wife. Suddenly they heard dogs barking, and words in a foreign language. Asta! Asta! Wo sind die Juden? There was a growing rumble over their heads. The Germans had climbed out of the dormer window onto the roof. Then the thundering in the black tin sky died down. Through the walls they heard quiet, sly blows. Someone was testing for echoes. The hiding place became silent. It was a terrible silence, a silence of tense shoulders and necks, of bared teeth, of eyes bulging out of their sockets. Then little Svetlana began her wordless lament. Her cries broke off very abruptly. David looked round and met the frenzied eyes of her mother, Rebecca Buckman. Once or twice since then, he had glimpsed those eyes, and the head of the little girl thrown right back like the head of a rag doll. He could remember everything that had happened before the war. Those memories came back to him all the time. He'd become like an old man, living on his past, loving it and cherishing it. On David's birthday, 12th of December, his mother had bought him a picture book. A small grey goat was standing in a clearing. The darkness of the forest seemed particularly sinister. Among the dark brown tree trunks, the toadstools and the fly agarics, and you could see the wolf's green eyes and his red jaw with its bared teeth. Only David knew about the now inevitable murder. He banged his fist on the table. He screened the goat with the palm of his hand. Then he knew there was no way he could save it. During the night he shouted out, "Mummy! Mummy! Mummy!" His mother woke up. As she came towards him, she was like a white cloud in the darkness. He yawned blissfully, knowing that the strongest power in the whole world was now defending him from the darkness of the forest. When he was older, it was the red dogs in the Jungle Book that most frightened him. One night his room had become filled with wild red beasts. He had made his way barefoot past the sticking-out chest of drawers to his mother's bed. When he was feverish and delirious, he always had the same nightmare. He was lying on a sandy beach, and tiny waves, no bigger than the smallest of little fingers, were tickling his body. Suddenly on the horizon appeared a blue mountain of water. It got bigger and bigger as it rushed silently towards him. David lay there on the warm sand. The dark blue mountain loomed over him. This was something even more terrible than the wolf and the red dogs. In the morning his mother would leave for work. He would go down the back stairs and pour a cup of milk into an empty crab meat can. This was for a thin, stray cat with a pale nose, weepy eyes, and a long, fine tail. And then one day a woman who lived next door had said that some people had come in the early morning and put that disgusting animal in a box and taken it away to the Institute. Thank God. Where on earth is this Institute? How can you expect me to go there? It's quite impossible. You'll just have to forget that unfortunate cat, his mother had said as she looked into his pleading eyes. How are you going to survive in the world? You mustn't let yourself be so vulnerable. His mother had wanted to send him to a children's summer camp. He had cried and pleaded with her, throwing up his hands in despair and shouting, "I promise I'll go to my grandmother's, but please not that camp." His mother had taken him to his grandmother's by train. On the way, he refused to eat. The idea of eating a hard-boiled egg or taking a meat rissole from a piece of greasy paper made him feel ashamed. His mother stayed there with him for the first 5 days, and then had to go back to work. He said goodbye to her without a single tear, but he's put his arms round her neck and hugged her so fiercely that she said, "Oh, you'll strangle me like that, you silly. There are lots and lots of cheap strawberries here, and in 2 months' time I'll come back and fetch you." There was a bus stop next to his grandmother's house. The bus went from the town to the tannery. The Ukrainian word for bus stop was zupinka. His late grandfather had been a member of the Jewish Bund. He had been very famous and had once lived in Paris. As a result, his grandmother was greatly respected and frequently given the sack from her work. He could hear radios blaring out through the open windows. "Attention! Attention! This is Radio Kiev speaking." In the daytime, the street was quite deserted. It only came to life when the apprentices at the tannery came past, calling out across the street, "Bella, did you pass? Yashka, come and help me go over Marxism again." In the evenings, everyone came home, the tannery workers, the shop assistants, and Sorok, an electrician at the local radio station. His grandmother worked for the trade union committee at the surgery. David never got bored, even when his grandmother was out. Not far from the house was an old orchard that didn't belong to anyone. Chickens, marked with paint, wandered about the decrepit apple trees that no longer bore fruit. An elderly goat grazed quietly. Ants appeared silently on the tall blades of grass. The town dwellers, the blackbirds and sparrows, behaved with noisy self-assurance, while the birds from the fields outside, birds whose names David didn't know, were like timid village maidens. He heard many words that were quite new to him. Glechik, Dikt, Kalyutsa, Ryazenka, Ryaska, Putsalo, Liadache, Koshenya. He could recognize in these words echoes and reflections of his own mother tongue. He heard Yiddish. He felt quite astonished when his mother and grandmother began speaking it together. Never before had he heard his mother speak a language he couldn't understand. His grandmother took David to visit her niece, stout Rebecca Bookman. David was struck by the number of white wicker blinds in her room. Edward Isakovich Bookman came in wearing a soldier's tunic and a pair of boots. He was the head accountant at the state bank. "Chaim," said Rebecca, "this is our guest from Moscow, Raya's son." "Go on then," she urged David. "Say hello to Uncle Edward." "Uncle Edward, why does Rebecca call you Chaim?" David asked. "That's a very difficult question," said Edward Bookman. "Don't you know that in England all Chimes are called Edward?" When the cat began scratching at the door, she finally managed to open it with her claws, and everyone saw an anxious-looking little girl sitting on a pot in the middle of the room. One Sunday David went with his grandmother to market. There were other women going in the same direction, old women in black dresses, peasant women in heavy boots, sullen, sleepy-looking women who worked as guards on the railways, haughty-looking women with red and blue handbags who were married to important local officials. Jewish beggars kept shouting at them in rude, angry voices. People seemed to give alms out of fear rather than compassion. Big trucks from the collective farms drove along the cobbled roadway, carrying sacks of potatoes and wickerwork cages full of hens that squawked at each pothole like a group of sickly old Jews. David saw a dead calf being dragged off a cart. Its pale mouth was hanging half open, and the curly white hairs on its neck were stained with blood. His grandmother bought a speckled hen. She carried it by its legs, which had been tied together with a white rag. David was walking beside her. He wanted to reach out and help the hen lift up its powerless head. He wondered how his grandmother could be so inhumanly cruel. David remembered some incomprehensible words of his mother's. She had said that his grandfather's relatives were members of the intelligentsia, while his grandmother's relatives were all shopkeepers and tradesmen. That must be why his grandmother didn't feel sorry for the hen. They went into a yard. An old man with a skull cap came out to meet them. His mother said something in Yiddish, and the old man picked up the hen in his hands and began mumbling. The hen cackled unsuspectingly. Then the old man did something very quick, something barely perceptible, but obviously terrible, and threw the hen over his shoulder. It ran off, feebly flapping its wings. David saw that it had no head. The body was running all by itself. The old man had killed it. After a few steps it fell to the earth, scratching with its young, powerful claws, and died. That night David felt as though the damp smell of dead cows and their slaughtered children had even got into his room. Death, who had once lived in a fairy tale forest where a fairy tale wolf was creeping up on a fairy tale goat, was no longer confined to the pages of a book. For the first time, David felt very clearly that he himself was mortal, not just in a fairy tale way, but in actual fact. He understood that one day his mother would die, and it wasn't from the fairy tale forest and the dim light of its fir trees that death would come for him and his mother. It would come from this very air, from these walls, from life itself, and there was no way they'd be able to hide from it. He sensed death with a depth and clarity of which only small children or great philosophers are capable, philosophers who are themselves almost childlike in the power and simplicity of their thinking. A calm, warm smell came from the big wardrobe and the chairs whose worn seats had been replaced by plywood boards. It was the same smell that came from his grandmother's hair and dress. A warm, deceptively calm night surrounded him. The living world was no longer confined to the pages of spelling books and the faces of toy bricks. David saw how much blue there was in the drake's dark wings, and how much gay, smiling mockery in the way he quacked. He climbed up the rough trunks of cherry trees and reached out to pick the white cherries that glowed among the leaves. He walked up to a calf that had been tethered on a patch of wasteland and offered him a sugar lump. Numb with happiness, he looked into the friendly eyes of this great baby. Red-haired little Pinchik came up to David and said to him, rolling his R's splendidly, "Let's have a scrap!" There was a little difference between the Jews and the Ukrainians, who lived in the different houses that looked onto his grandmother's yard. Old Partinskaya called on his grandmother and said in her drawling voice, "Guess what, Rosa Nuzinovna? Sonia's going to Kiev. She's made it up with her husband again." His grandmother threw up her hands and laughed. What a farce! David found he liked this world better than his own Kirov Street, where an old woman called Drago Dragon, with waved hair and a lot of rouge, went for walks with her poodle, where a ZIS 101 limousine waited outside the front door every morning, where a woman with a pince nez and a cigarette between her made-up lips stood over the communal gas stove, furiously muttering, "You Trotskist, you've moved my coffee off the burner again." It had been night when he and his mother arrived at the station. In the moonlight they had walked down the cobbled street, past the white Catholic church, where a niche in the wall housed a rather thin, bowed Christ, about the height of a 12-year-old, his head crowned with thorns, and past the teacher training college, where his mother had once studied. A few days later, on Friday evening, David saw the old men walking to the synagogue through the clouds of golden dust kicked up by the barefooted footballers on the wasteland. There was a heart-rending charm in this juxtaposition of white Ukrainian huts, squeaking well handles, and the ancient patterns of black and white prayer shawls. Everything was jumbled together. Kobzar, Pushkin, Tolstoy, physics textbooks, Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder, and the sons of cobblers and tailors who had first come here at the time of the Civil War, teachers from the Raycom, orators and troublemakers from the district trade union Soviets, truck drivers, detectives, lecturers in Marxism. It was at his grandmother's that David first learned that his mother was unhappy. Aunt Rachel, a stout woman whose cheeks were so red that she seemed to be always blushing, was the first person to tell him. "Leaving such a wonderful woman as your mother, well, he'll live to regret it." By the following day, David knew that his father had left his mother for a Russian woman who was 8 years his older, that he earned 2,500 rubles a month in the Philharmonia Society, and that his mother refused to accept any alimony and lived on the 310 rubles a month she earned herself. Once David showed his grandmother the cocoon he kept in a little matchbox. "Ah, what do you want that filth for? Throw it away," she ordered. Twice David went to the goods yard and watched bulls, rams and pigs being loaded into the cattle wagons. He heard one of the bulls bellowing loudly, complaining and asking for pity. The boy's soul was filled with horror, but the tired railway workers in their torn, dirty jackets didn't so much as look round. A week after David's arrival, Deborah, one of his grandmother's neighbours, gave birth to her first child. She was the wife of Lazar Yankelevich, a machinist in the agricultural machinery factory. The previous year she'd been to visit her sister in Kolyma and had been struck by lightning during a storm. They'd tried to give her artificial respiration, but finally gave up and buried her. She had lain there, as though dead, for 2 hours, and now she'd given birth to a child. She'd been sterile for 15 years. His grandmother told David all this and then added, "That's what they say, but did she have an operation last year?" David and his grandmother went to call on Deborah. "Well, Lucia! Well, Deborah!" said David's grandmother, looking at the little creature in the washing basket. There was something almost threatening in the way she pronounced these words, as though she were warning the father and mother never to be frivolous about the miracle that had just taken place. There was an old woman called Sorgina, who lived in a little house by the railway line with her 2 sons. They were both deaf-mutes and both worked as hairdressers. All their neighbours were afraid of the family. Yes, they're as quiet as mice till they get drunk," old Partinskaya told David, "but when they get drunk, they snatch up their knives and rush at one another, screaming and squealing like a pair of horses." Once David's grandmother sent him round to Musya Borisovna with a jar of sour cream. The librarian's room was tiny. There was a little cup on a table, some little books on a shelf fixed to the wall, and a little photograph hanging over her bed. It was a photograph of David in swaddling clothes together with his mother. When David looked at the photograph, Musya Borisovna blushed and said, "Your mother and I shared the same desk at school." He read out the fable of the ant and the grasshopper, and she very quietly read the poem "Sasha was crying as they cut down the forest." In the morning the whole yard was buzzing. Solomon's Slipoy's fur coat had been stolen. It had been sewn up in mothballs for the summer. "God be praised," said his grandmother. "It's the least he deserves." David learned that Slipoy had been an informer and had betrayed lots of people at the time of the confiscation of foreign currency and gold coins. He had informed on people again in 1937. 2 of the people he betrayed had been shot, and 1 had died in a prison hospital. Night and its strange noises, birdsong, innocent blood, everything was mixed together into a rich, seething stew. Decades later, David might have been able to understand it, but even at the time he was aware both of its horror and of its poignant charm. Before slaughtering infected cattle, various preparatory measures have to be carried out. Pits and trenches must be dug, the cattle must be transported to where they're to be slaughtered, instructions must be issued to qualified workers. If the local population helps the authorities to convey the infected cattle to the slaughtering points and to catch beasts that have run away, they do this not out of hatred of cows and calves, but out of an instinct for self-preservation. Similarly, when people are to be slaughtered en masse, the local population is not immediately gripped by a bloodthirsty hatred of the old men, women and children who are to be destroyed. It's necessary to prepare the population by means of a special campaign. And in this case, it's not enough to rely merely on the instinct for self-preservation. It is necessary to stir up feelings of real hatred and revulsion. It was in such an atmosphere that the Germans carried out the extermination of the Ukrainian and Belarusian Jews. And at an early date, in the same regions, Stalin himself had mobilized the fury of the masses, whipping it up to the point of frenzy during the campaigns to liquidate the kulaks as a class, and during the extermination of Trotskyist, Bukharinite degenerates and saboteurs. Experience showed that such campaigns make the majority of the population obey every order of the authorities, as though hypnotized. There is a particular minority which actually helps to create the atmosphere of these campaigns: ideological fanatics, people who take a bloodthirsty delight in the misfortunes of others, and people who want to settle personal scores, to steal a man's belongings or take over his flat or job. Most people, however, are horrified at mass murder, but they hide this, not only from their families, but even from themselves. These are the people who fill the meeting halls during the campaigns of destruction. However vast these halls or frequent these meetings, very few of them ever disturbed the quiet unanimity of the voting. Still fewer, of course, rather than turning away from the beseeching gaze of a dog suspected of rabies, dared to take the dog in and allow it to live in their houses. Nevertheless, this did happen. The first half of the 20th century may seem a time of great scientific discoveries, revolutions, immense social transformations, and 2 world wars. It will go down in history, however, as the time when, in accordance with philosophies of race and society, whole sections of the European population were exterminated. Understandably, the present day remains discreetly silent about this. One of the most astonishing human traits that came to light at this time was obedience. There were cases of huge queues being formed by people awaiting execution, and it was the victims themselves who regulated the movement of these queues. There were hot summer days when people had to wait from early morning until late at night. Some mothers prudently provided themselves with bread and bottles of water for their children. Millions of innocent people, knowing that they would soon be arrested, said goodbye to their nearest and dearest in advance, and prepared little bundles containing spare underwear and a towel. Millions of people lived in vast camps that had not only been built by prisoners, but were even guarded by them. And it wasn't merely tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but hundreds of millions of people who were obedient witnesses of this slaughter of the innocent. Nor were they merely obedient witnesses. When ordered to, they gave their support to this slaughter, voting in favour of it, amid a hubbub of voices. There was something unexpected in the degree of their obedience. There was, of course, resistance. There were acts of courage and determination on the part of those who had been condemned. There were uprisings. There were men who risked their own lives and the lives of their families in order to save the life of a stranger. But the obedience of the vast mass of people is undeniable. Now, what does this tell us? That a new trait has suddenly appeared in human nature? No. This obedience bears witness to a new force acting on human beings. The extreme violence of totalitarian social systems proved able to paralyze the human spirit throughout whole continents. A man who's placed his soul in the service of fascism declares an evil and dangerous slavery to be the only true good. Rather than overtly renouncing human feelings, he declares the crimes committed by fascism to be the highest form of humanitarianism. He agrees to divide people up into the pure and worthy and the impure and unworthy. The instinct for self-preservation is supported by the hypnotic power of world ideologies. These call people to carry out any sacrifice, to accept any means, in order to achieve the highest of ends, the future greatness of the motherland, world progress, the future happiness of mankind, of a nation, of a class, One more force cooperated with the life instinct and the power of great ideologies: terror at the limitless violence of a powerful state, terror at the way murder had become the basis of everyday life. The violence of a totalitarian state is so great as to be no longer a means to an end. It becomes an object of mystical worship and adoration. How else can one explain the way certain intelligent, thinking Jews declared the slaughter of the Jews to be necessary for the happiness of mankind? That in the view of this they were ready to take their own children to be executed, ready to carry out the sacrifice once demanded of Abraham. How else can one explain the case of a gifted, intelligent poet, himself a peasant by birth, who with sincere conviction wrote a long poem celebrating the terrible years of suffering undergone by the peasantry, years that had swallowed up his own father, an honest and simple-hearted labourer? Another fact that allowed fascism to gain power over men was their blindness. A man cannot believe that he's about to be destroyed. The optimism of people standing on the edge of the grave is astounding. The soil of hope, a hope that was senseless and sometimes dishonest and despicable, gave birth to a pathetic obedience that was often equally despicable. The Warsaw Rising, the uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibor, the various mutinies of Brenner's were all born of hopelessness, but then utter hopelessness engenders not only resistance and uprising, but also a yearning to be executed as quickly as possible. People argued over their place in the queue beside the blood-filled ditch, while a mad, almost exultant voice shouted out, "Don't be afraid, Jews! It's nothing terrible! 5 minutes and it will all be over!" Everything gave rise to obedience, both hope and hopelessness. It is important to consider what a man must have suffered and endured in order to feel glad at the thought of his impending execution. It is especially important to consider this if one is inclined to moralize, to reproach the victims for their lack of resistance in conditions of which one has little conception. Having established man's readiness to obey when confronted with limitless violence, we must go on to draw one further conclusion that is of importance for an understanding of man and his future. Does human nature undergo a true change in the cauldron of totalitarian violence? Does man lose his innate yearning for freedom? The fate of both man and the totalitarian state depends on the answer to this question. If human nature does change, then the eternal and worldwide triumph of the dictatorial state is assured. If his yearning for freedom remains constant, then the totalitarian state is doomed. The Great Rising in the Warsaw Ghetto and the uprisings in Treblinka and Sobibor, the vast partisan movement that flared up in dozens of countries enslaved by Hitler, the uprisings in Berlin in 1953 and Hungary in 1956, and in the labour camps of Siberia and the Far East after Stalin's death, the riots at this time in Poland, the number of factories that went on strike, and the student protests that broke out in many cities against the suppression of freedom of thought, all these bear witness to the indestructibility of man's yearning for freedom. This yearning was suppressed, but it continued to exist. Man's fate may make him a slave, but his nature remains unchanged. Man's innate yearning for freedom can be suppressed but never destroyed. Totalitarianism cannot renounce violence. If it does, it perishes. Eternal, ceaseless violence, overt or covert, is the basis of totalitarianism. Man does not renounce freedom voluntarily. This conclusion holds out hope for our time, hope for the future. An electronic machine can carry out mathematical calculations, remember historical facts, play chess, translate books from one language to another. It's able to solve mathematical problems more quickly than man, and its memory is faultless. Is there any limit to progress, or to its ability to create machines in the image and likeness of man? It seems that the answer is no. It's not impossible to imagine the machine of future ages and millennia. It'll be able to listen to music and appreciate art. It will even be able to compose melodies, paint pictures, write poems. Is there a limit to its perfection? Can it be compared to man? Will it surpass him? Childhood memories, tears of happiness, the bitterness of parting, love of freedom, feelings of pity for a sick puppy, nervousness, a mother's tenderness, thoughts of death, sadness, friendship, love of the weak, sudden hope, a fortunate guess, melancholy, unreasoning joy, sudden embarrassment. The machine will be able to recreate all of this. But the surface of the whole Earth will be too small to accommodate this machine, whose dimensions and weight will continually increase as it attempts to reproduce the peculiarities of mind and soul of an average, inconspicuous human being. Fascism annihilated tens of millions of people.